Now, I've just come across this report from NASA, and this is from 1973. It's kind of highlighting their achievements for the year. Looking back at this old report, I find it very, very revealing, as we're about to see. We've got several clips to look at, and the claims and the clips we're looking at are going to get progressively worse. First up, we're going to start with Skylab, America's first space station, supposedly, which is meant to be in this vacuum of space. But as we're about to see, it's got like this tarp covering on the top of it, flapping about as if Skylab, the American space station's on a day out, on a windy day at a British seaside resort. It's flapping all over the place. Ridiculous. Now, I'd originally shown that clip, thinking it was an early ISS. Clearly I was wrong, but let's have a look at the first clip anyway.
In space, 1973. These were the highlights. This was the year of Skylab. Skylab got off to a shaky start when a heat-deflecting micrometeoroid shield was ripped off during launch, causing the loss of one solar wing and jamming the other. Although in orbit, the big space station was overheating and low on power. People on the ground, however, hastily designed a replacement, an umbrella-like device that would...
So they've invented this umbrella device to help the overheating issue regarding the Skylab space station. But as we're about to see, this umbrella device looks like it's on a jolly day out at a British seaside resort as it's flapping all over the place, strangely enough, in the vacuum of space.
Protect the workshop's thin skin from the hot sun. The first crew then used the newly designed sunshade to repair the overheating space station. They also deployed the jammed solar wing. Result, an increase in electrical power and a cooler place to work.
Result, a space station that looks like it's on a day out at a windy day at a British seaside resort. Sweet. Ridiculous, lads. Now we're on to the space shuttle and the X-24B plane.
It's called the reusable space shuttle. Taking off like a rocket and landing like an airplane, it will virtually replace the way we transport manned and unmanned spacecraft into orbit by the early 1980s. To prepare for the shuttle, research and development programs continued to move ahead as high-speed wind tunnels were used to help solve the problems of re-entry. Here, undergoing tests, are special recoverable booster rockets that will be retrieved after launch. Other engineers prepare to make shuttle vibration studies, finding out where the stress areas are. At NASA's Flight Research Center in California, the X-24B lifting body was airdropped several times. The X-24 is developing maneuvering and landing capabilities for future aerospace vehicles like the Space Shuttle.
So the X-24B here, the one we've just seen on the screen, is doing the test and maneuvers to pave the way for the Space Shuttle. But as we're about to see when we look at the specs of the X-24B, in relation to the Space Shuttle specs, there's a huge gaping hole there, which I find, again, incredibly revealing. So according to the official sources, the Space Shuttle orbited the Earth 150 to 200 miles up, whilst doing 17,500 miles an hour. And if that's the case, the re-entry speeds of the Space Shuttle will be 17,500 miles an hour, according to the official sources. So I find it very strange when I look at the specs regarding the test craft that paved the way for the Space Shuttle to supposedly do what it did. Little quick read. The X-24 was an American experimental aircraft developed from the joint United States Air Force and NASA program named Pilot. It was designed and built to test lifting body concepts, experimenting with the concept of an unpowered re-entry and landing, later used by the Space Shuttle. Originally built as the X-24A, the aircraft was later rebuilt as the X-24B, which is the model we're interested in because that was the one that related to the Space Shuttle in particular. We scroll down a smidge. Where is it? X-24B, here we go. The X-24B demonstrated that Accra unpowered re-entry vehicle landings were operationally feasible. Top speed achieved by the X-24B was 1,164 miles an hour, and its highest altitude it reached was 74,000 feet. Now that's incredibly revealing. The specs regarding the test vehicle that supposedly paved the way for the space shuttle are nowhere near the specs of the space shuttle. Remember, space shuttle's re-entry speed, 17,500 miles an hour, supposedly, coming in from a height of 150 to 200 miles in altitude. Test vehicle, top speed 1,000 miles an hour, just over. Highest altitude, 74,000 feet. There's a gaping hole there, and lots of question marks left. But to me, it's quite obvious. The test vehicle that paved the way for the space shuttle, its statistics are a lot more realistic than the actual space shuttle's statistics regarding so-called space. That's why the test vehicle statistics are so different to the space shuttle statistics. There's no way any of those so-called craft are doing 17,500 miles an hour anyway. If they were, the test craft that supposedly paved the way would be doing a lot faster speeds on its so-called successful test runs. You wouldn't just go from that to suddenly flying 17,500 miles an hour and then doing re-entry at those speeds, when the vehicle that tested and laid the way done nowhere near that. Like I say, I think this vehicle is kind of related to more about these top speeds and what's achievable with the shuttle, heights and space, than the actual space shuttle statistics. I think probably you're looking at top end 20 miler is sort of somewhere near the highest you can go with balloons, a little bit lower with rockets and planes. Like I say, the discrepancy between the test vehicle and the official statistics regarding the space shuttle I find very revealing. Now we're moving on to NASA's Early Earth Observing Satellites, known as ERTS, later renamed Landsat.
Santa Barbara, California, Louisiana and Mississippi, Cleveland, Ohio. All these places, like many others, have one thing in common. Each was photographed by the Earth Resources Technology satellite orbiting 570 miles overhead. Since being launched in mid-1972, the Earth Resources spacecraft has returned nearly 100,000 pictures of our planet.
I've just got to stop you there, my dear man. So this satellite, apparently, that's 570 miles above the Earth, orbiting, has produced over 100,000 pictures. Was that right? Let me just come back and double check.
72. The Earth Resources spacecraft has returned nearly 100,000 pictures of our planet.
I'd like to know, my dear man, how did it get the pictures to you guys if it's in space 570 miles up above the Earth? If you were to send the pictures down in some sort of canister, they would have burnt up. If it was data sent, then it would be images and not pictures. But you've clearly shown us pictures and told us it was pictures.
Overhead. Since being launched in mid-1972, the Earth Resources spacecraft has returned nearly 100,000 pictures of our...
Yeah, pictures. And what makes this even worse for you guys is that is a very similar setup and film to what comes out of the U-2 spy plane. Very similar setup. Bear with me. Now, the reason I mentioned the U-2 spy plane is because in 1971, NASA acquired two U-2 spy planes, which is bizarre. 2 years after they've supposedly landed man on the moon, and 2 years after the U-2 spy plane is supposedly retired because of the SR-71, you've got the space superpower known as NASA purchasing two old U-2 spy planes, as we're about to see here, and they continue to operate them to this day. NASA operates two Lockheed ER-2 resource aircraft as flying laboratories in the Airborne Science Program under the agency's Science Mission Directive. Where is it about the actual history? NASA acquired its first ER-2 aircraft in 81 and its second in 89. They replaced the two Lockheed U-2 aircraft which NASA had used to collect data since 1971. How revealing. So now I'm over at Wiki, Landsat 1, the satellites, which we've just seen the imagery from, which strangely enough has the same roll of film setup system that the U-2 spy plane has, that strangely enough NASA just acquired 2 years before this satellite pantomime began. And it gets even worse. Landsat 1, just coming down, all we're interested in really is the development, because we know NASA have now got, or had in 71, two U-2 spy planes. And we look at the development here. Definition studies for two Earth observation satellites began in 67. The satellites were named ERTS and were individually known as ERTS-A and ERTS-B. So 2 years before these satellites went and supposedly did their thing, NASA bought old spy planes that should have been retired in 1969. Old spy planes, as we're about to see, that do the very same job as these so-called satellites. And they're going to bust themselves now, as you're about to see. Cue NASA's U-2 spy planes and, of course, the cover story for the Landsat satellites.
Helping verify images from spacecraft are the U-2 high-altitude Earth survey planes, flying at altitudes of 65,000 feet.
So they're verifying the images that supposedly come from space with the photography that comes from this plane. But strangely enough, we saw the clip just now from this same documentary showing rolls of film that supposedly came from space, which of course we know resemble the photography setup of the U-2 spy plane. So this cover story is quite obvious. The U-2 is not verifying images from space. It's taking the pictures that supposedly come from space.
The U-2 has evolved into a sophisticated research tool in its own right. These are just a few of the high-quality pictures returned. Pictures that have spotted smoke from forest fires in California and helped survey the extent of damage done by tree-killing tussock.
Awesome photography. And as we're about to see now when we do a comparison, kind of looks exactly the same as the so-called Landsat photography, which is taken apparently hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles higher up. So this is from the U-2 at 65,000 feet, and this is from the satellite at 570 miles. 65,000 feet, 570 miles. U-2 again, 65,000 feet. Supposed satellite, 570 miles. 65,000 feet, 570 miles. 570 miles, 65,000 feet. It's the same. The Landsat satellite is the U-2 spy plane, NASA's own version. It's obvious, just based on the photography. And of course, if this camera was that good from 570 miles out, then you'd install that camera on the U-2 so you've got even better clarity to zoom in. You can't, because that's the limits of the time, which of course are exactly the same as the so-called camera that's 570 miles away, as opposed to 65,000 feet. So obviously it's all come from the U-2. It's the same. It's obvious. There's no difference of like over 550 miles there or whatever it is. And if there was, you'd have the camera that's supposedly in space on the spy plane. Absolutely ridiculous and so obvious. Here's the modular payloads available to NASA. This is old photo back in the day. This is all the different things that plane could do. This is why NASA still have it to this day. because it does so many of the jobs that they cite come from satellites actually come from this plane. Another one. I'm just going to show you the camera on the U-2 spy plane fairly recently.
On short notice, but its wet film cameras are even more astounding. Located at the belly of the airplane and as big as a film projector, they can distinguish objects as close to 8 inches to as far as 70,000 feet apart. On short notice, but its wet film...
Look familiar, did it? Bear with me. Remember the photography that was cited from the Landsat satellite at the start? Obviously, that's an enlarged photograph they've got there. That was the setup they had. Bearing in mind, this is in the 70s. And now let's look at the U-2. Fairly recent. It's the same setup, just a more modern version of it. How obvious do these people need to make it? To wrap up then, this 1973 annual report by NASA, which of course was very, very revealing, we had Skylab expose itself, seemingly appearing to be at a British seaside resort on a windy day, highlighting the fact that it wasn't in this vacuum of space. Then we had the space shuttle exposed by the test craft that paved the way for the space shuttle. And of course, it kept getting worse and worse. Then we had the U-2 spy plane totally expose the Landsat satellites with its photography and the footage and the claims we were shown in this annual report. And of course, it's not difficult. This is 65,000 feet. This is supposed to be 570 miles away. 65,000 feet, 570 miles above the Earth. It's obvious they're about the same height and been filmed by the same camera. Because if this was filmed from 570 miles away, you'd have that camera on the U-2 spy plane and it would be able to do a much better job. It's obvious that that is from the U-2 spy plane for that reason alone. And of course, the photographs look exactly the same. And of course, space, i.e. this environment of a vacuum, where they leave an air pressure system sphere Earth and go to a vacuum, is scientifically impossible anyway. So this shouldn't be difficult. But all you need is a bit of discernment. And like I've just done here, I've looked at the 73 annual report, looked at the timelines, and highlight the absurdity of NASA and space.